sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it. Lest haply, after he hath laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. What's the world saying about the church, about Christians? Think back to that moment of salvation, the zeal, the excitement, the fire, the willingness to go and tell everybody what you got, what Christ has done for you. And we're all pumped up and we start to build on that. But somewhere at some point we run out of money. And we can't finish it. Which one has not said that? You got to count the cost. And you got to make a choice. And you got to make a decision. Am I willing to pay the cost? Am I willing to pay the price? Am I willing to give up my pleasure, my time fishing, my time working overtime to make more money, my time with the family? Am I willing to give up all those things and put Christ first so I can finish what He put me here to do, what He put me here to build? Because if we are not, the world's going to look at us and they're going to make fun of us and they're going to point at us and they're going to jest at us, and they were all talk, and they can say we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and they ain't done nothing. If you're going to be a disciple, you got to do those things I started out with, but you got to do this too. You got to count the cost.
That's right.
What are you willing to give? What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to put up with? What are you willing to suffer? Suffer? No. God is a good God. And He loves me. And everybody I see on TV tells me He just wants me to be prosperous. And He wants me to have a big house. And He wants me to have a nice car. And He wants me to have an airplane. And if I'm a good Christian, I'll never get sick. And if I'm a good Christian, nothing bad will ever happen to me. That's not Bible.
That's right.
Jesus said, take up the cross. The cross is an instrument of torture, an instrument of pain, an instrument of discomfort. And He said, if you're not willing to take all that on you, you can't be a disciple. Now, you got to count the cost. How much am I willing to suffer? How much am I willing to give up? Because I'm going to tell you something. If you truly choose to be a disciple of Christ, and if you truly choose to follow Christ, sometimes the devil's going to come at you.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
All the time, the world's going to come at you.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Most of the time, your own flesh is going to come at you. Because these three are contrary to God. They don't like you liking God. They don't like you wanting God. They don't like you living for God. And they are going to fight against you. So as a child of God, you are going to suffer. You will. But you got to count the cost. How much are you willing to suffer? How much are you willing to give up? Are you willing to give up all your pleasure? Are you willing to give up your extra things? Are you willing to give up time with the family, time with people you love? Are you willing to lay all this down and put Christ ahead of everything else? Because if you're not, you cannot be His disciple. I know I repeat, but I repeat so that you tie it all together and it sinks in. First and foremost, Christ first. You have to love everything and everybody else less than you love Christ. Christ has to be at the top of the list. He said if you don't put Him before your father and your mother and your wife or your husband or your children or your grandchildren or your brothers or your sisters, if you don't put Him above them, you cannot be His disciple. And then He goes on and He says, if you're not willing to bear the pain that comes with it, you cannot be His disciple. If you're not willing to do things you don't want to do, you can't be His disciple. If you're not willing to be made fun of, if you're not willing to be frustrated, if you're not willing to be aggravated, if you're not willing to have to deal with things you don't want to deal with and do things you don't want to do, you can't be His disciple. Then He goes on and He says, but if you're going to be a disciple, count the cost. Don't get halfway into this thing and quit, because that's worse than never starting. Because once you do that, that brings reproach on Christ, on the church, and on yourself. You get halfway into this thing, and then you just give up on it, and you quit, and you just decide, I'm just going to sit on the pew, and I'm not going to do anything. Then they begin to look at you. And don't you think they don't? They see a lot more than you think they see. And they say things like, wow, she used to always be out there witnessing and testifying and doing this and doing that. I don't see that anymore. He used to always be talking about Christ. He was always going here and doing this, and he was always going there and doing that for Christ. I don't see that anymore. And I know I use this little thing often, but it's the truth. Then what they say is, what kind of a God do they serve? What kind of a God is it they got? We've got to count the cost. We've got to make a choice. And God forces nothing on nobody. It is a choice. It is a decision. And he lets you know what's going to come. He lets you know what you're facing if you make that choice. But he calls you to make a choice. You've got to decide, is it all Christ or not? That's the choice you've got to make. That's the decision you've got to make. You have got to determine in your heart and in your mind, I'm putting Christ first. And because Christ is first, then the things of Christ are first. Because Christ is first, because I want to be a disciple, because I want to serve him, because I want to be of value to him, then I'm putting him above everything else. And in order to do that, and again, you can agree or disagree, there's the door if you want to go. I'm going to tell you this. You got to put the church before your own pleasure, before your own desires, before your own comfort. Because the church is the body of Christ. Because the church is what Christ set up. Christ said, on this rock I will build my church. And when you are born again, you become a member of the church. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's got to be this place. But you have got to serve the church of Christ. In order to serve Christ on earth, you have got to serve the church of Christ. Because he established it. He ordained it. He set it up. And this is what works on this earth. This is how he chose to do it. But you got to choose. Make a decision. Count the cost. And I encourage you that you would really examine it, really think about it, and make a determination. Am I going to serve God or am I not? Because there is a consequence. There is a consequence. He said, which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he can finish it or not? Because perhaps you begin, you lay the foundation, and then you can't go any further, and they begin to mock you. And when they mock you, who are they really mocking? Jesus. Christ. Because you're his representative. You're his ambassador. You're his spokesperson. So if you're going to do it, either do it all the way, or don't even start.
That's right.
Because you're giving him a bad name.
That's right.
We tell them that we're Christians. And again, I want you to think back. You laid a foundation and you got all on fire when Christ saved your soul. And you were all pumped up and you were all full of zeal. And you wanted to tell everybody. And you had that thing going. And then at some point, the cost got too great. And you quit. That's a reflection on him.
That's right.
And we need to choose, church. We need to decide. I'm either all in or I'm all out.
That's right.
That's right.
We need to make that decision. We need to make that choice. Christ gave what?
All.
Everything. And that's what he expects of us. To give our all.
That's right.
That's right.
And if we're not going to do that, let's quit playing.
Amen.
Let's be honest with ourselves and be honest with God. God, I'm not willing to do that. Just go. He already knows it. He already knows your heart said it. You might as well admit it to yourself. I'm not willing to do that. If you want to be a disciple, you must be willing to do that. Always put Christ first and the things of the kingdom first. It has to be that way. Because like he said here, there is a cost. And the church needs to understand that. The church today is being told it's all comfort, it's all ease, it's all blessing. But it's not. There's a price to pay. That's why Jesus said, take up the cross. Because there is a cost. There is a price to pay. I'm going to jump ahead here. He goes on, he talks about the king going out to make war that has to make a decision whether he can win the battle or not. You got to make that decision. What does that king do? If that king decides he can't win the battle, he sends and asks for conditions of surrender, for conditions of peace, instead of even fighting the battle. If you think about this and you know you can't do it, then you need to go to God and tell God, I know I can't do it. God will give you what you need to do it. If you have the desire, if that's what you really want, God will strengthen you. God will encourage you. God will support you. God will help you. God will infuse you with whatever you need. But you've got to decide. You've got to make the choice. You've got to examine yourself. And the way the Bible puts it, you've got to count the cost. And then make the decision. Am I able to do this or am I not? Am I going to do this or am I not? We've got to make that choice. He gives these examples. Again, I'm repeating because I want to keep tying it all back together. To be a disciple of Christ, Christ has to be first. Everything else you've got to love less. Everything, everybody, you've got to love less. You've got to be willing to take the pain. You've got to be willing to take the aggravation, the giving up of what you would like to do, what you want to do, what gives you pleasure. You've got to be willing to do all that. If you're not willing to do these things, you're not his disciple. But here's what you've got to do, he said. You've got to count the cost first. Make sure you're going to be able to do this thing. Because if you just get halfway into it and you can't complete it, then they're going to mock you. And they're going to mock Christ. And it's going to make Christ look bad. And if you can't complete it, you know that you can't. You know that you can't do it. Then you've got to be like this king. You have to come to God and say, I know I can't. And I surrender to you. And God will help you. But you've got to have that desire first. You've got to want to be able to do it. But then he goes on and he says, so likewise, whosoever he be of you, that forsaketh not all that he hath, cannot be my disciple. You have to be willing to forsake all that you have. He's not telling you take a vow of poverty, own just sackcloth, one robe of sackcloth and go live in a cave. That's not what he's talking about. But you have to have a readiness, a willingness to give up everything and anything for the cause of Christ. He says, so likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not, or doesn't have a readiness and a willingness to give up all that he hath, cannot be my disciple. Everything else, it's just like you have to consider yourself dead to sin, dead to the world. This now belongs to Christ. I've given it to him. Present yourself a living sacrifice. You have to give everything to him. You have to be willing to give it all up for him. Anybody, listen, that is not ready to forsake all that he hath cannot be my disciple. Read the book. There were those who had to give up family, had to give up home, all the way up to their lives for Christ. We've got to be willing to go that far, or we cannot be his disciple. We cannot be what we say that we are. We say that we are disciples. But when we start looking at what it is to be a disciple, are we really? Is Christ first? Do we love everything and everybody else less? Are we willing to take whatever pain, whatever uncomfort, whatever we got to bear and still follow him? Are we ready to forsake everything, everything for Christ? If today He called you and said, and I'm not saying He's going to do this, but think about it. If He said, quit your job, sell everything that you have and every bit of money that you make from it, take and give it to the Salvation Army. Pack a bag, just one bag with whatever clothes you can get in that bag. I want you to go to Philadelphia, to the inner city, and I want you to stand on the corner and preach the gospel. How many of us would do that? How many of us would give up everything, our comfort, our security, everything else that we had, and go do that? We've got to be willing to do that. And I'm not saying He's going to call you to do that. I'm not going to say He's not either. But He said, if we're not willing to forsake everything and do whatever it is that He calls us to do, we cannot be His disciple. We really need to think about this. I know I say these sort of things a lot, but the church has tried to make Christianity so easy and so comfortable. But it's really not. No, in this country at this point, we're not being beheaded yet or anything like that. But it's still uncomfortable because you got to fight the flesh. The flesh wants pleasure. The flesh wants comfort. The flesh wants to go do this rather than what God wants you to do. And all those kind of things. We have to realize there is a cost. And that's why He says to count the cost. Are you willing to pay what needs to be paid? Are you willing to do that? He said, and we're going to get into this, you are the salt. You all know the scripture, and He touches on that here too. But listen what He said. You are the salt. And salt is good. But if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith will it be seasoned? It's neither fit for the land, nor yet for the dunghill. But men cast it out. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. You're the salt. If you're a child of God, you're the salt. We're the salt. We're the light. You all know the scriptures. Now listen. I've preached on that. I've heard it preached on. And a lot of time it's just standalone scripture. That's the whole sermon, being the salt. But listen, He's talking about being a disciple. And then He says, you are the salt. But if the salt has lost its savor, this comes after He says, if you don't love me more than you love everything and everybody else, if you don't put me ahead of everything and everybody else, if you're not willing to bear the pain and the frustration and the aggravation and the discomfort and doing things you don't want to do and all that, He says, if you're not willing to count the cost, He says, if you're not willing to forsake all that you have, you can't be my disciple. Salt's good. But if the salt has lost its savor, what's He saying? Think about that. You've got to put this all together and take this all in context. What is He saying? To be a disciple means to be all these things. You love Christ more. You put Him ahead of everything else. You take the discomfort. You take whatever comes with being it. You count the cost. You're willing to give up anything and everything for God. What does that mean? You're salt with savor. If you're not willing to do these things, you've lost your savor. And you're not good for anything but to be cast out and be trodden under the foot of men. How much of the church world today is trampled on by the world?
Amen.
Under the foot of men.
That's right.
Because we have lost our savor. What is our savor? It's all these things that I just read to you. He talks about what it is to be a disciple, what is required to be a disciple, what you've got to do to be a disciple, what you've got to be willing to give up. You've got to count the cost. You've got to do all those things. But if you have lost your savor, you're not good for anything. If all you're going to do is come and sit on the pew, if all you're going to do is stay in the shaker, of what value?
That's right.
What good are we? I know I say this a lot. I believe we are in the last days. I believe we are in the end time. How long that is, I have no idea. But according to what I read in the Word and what I see out there, it's winding down. And I believe